Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic, roaming the digitosphere. Vic Viena, Forrest, the whole team, all members of the crew. Congratulations to crew and friend Brianna Joy Gray. She is Bernie Sanders' new press secretary. We're going to win this thing. I'm Michael Brooks, of course. On this week's program, Daniel Bessner and Harvey J.K. join us in studio. The clash of the historians. There's a lot of heat. No, I'm just playing. We're going to be talking about the historical effort to suppress America's progressive history by the oligarchs and the right. We're going to talk about democracy in foreign policy. And we're going to also, in the post-game review, some of Elizabeth Warren's town hall, get a history lesson on A. Philip Randolph, and much, much more with Daniel and Harvey. J.R. Bolsonaro was in Washington, D.C., meeting his fellow clown fascist Donald Trump, and he was on the prime network of global fascism, Fox News. We'll have a review of his appearance, as well as a good monkey wrench that Glenn Greenwald threw in it. We also have to talk about hunger riots against austerity, against IMF policies in Macri's Argentina. The AFL-CIO gives political prisoner Lula da Silva its Human Rights Award, and we'll explain again why the struggle globally against fascism is connected to the freeing of Lula. All that and much, much more on today's Michael Brooks Show, this week's Michael Brooks Show. And Harvey and Daniel will come up on stage in about 50 minutes. We have to start with the atrocities of this past week in Christchurch in New Zealand. A white-wing, white supremacist terrorist killed 49 people in an act of clearly politically motivated, fascistic, white supremacist, anti-Muslim terrorism. And this is a global trend. This connects everything from the Golden Dawn Party in Greece, Donald Trump in the White House, the terrorist attack on the synagogue of several months ago. This is what it is, and anybody who would try to cloud it is either an advocate of these things or a useful idiot and agent for these things. And it didn't come out of nowhere. It's risen from a global system of settler colonialism, imperialism, and the cultural corollary of white supremacy. In his essay, The Age of Humanism is Ending, Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe warned us of the following. Neoliberal capitalism has left in its wake a multitude of destroyed subjects, many of whom are deeply convinced that their immediate future will be one of continuous exposure to violence and existential threat. They genuinely long for a return to some sense of certainty, the sacred, hierarchy, religion, and tradition. They believe that nations have become akin to swamps that need to be drained, and the world as it should be brought to an end. And the world as it is should be brought to an end. For this to happen, everything should be cleansed off. They are convinced that they can only be saved in a violent struggle to restore their masculinity, the loss of which they attribute to the weaker among them, the weak they do not want to become. These atrocities cannot be separated from systems that cultivate them, and you cannot make excuses for apartheid and racism in one country and condemn these acts of barbarity in another. Now, sometimes it's, and of course, Mbembe is exactly right, sometimes it's like what happened in New Zealand. Sometimes it's a police officer in South Carolina murdering a suspect, a black man, running away from him, shooting him in the back. It's an ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples across the world. It's the murder of Marielle Franco by a right-wing paramilitary gang. It's the children in Palestine watching their homes bulldozed over while the American company Caterpillar profits from the devastation. It's the murderer firing at children in Norway to protect an imagined ethno-state. It's racism, it's white supremacy, it's homophobia, it's transphobia, and it is in fact capitalism. These atrocities and terrorist attacks may be conducted by individuals, but they are caused by systems and deployed for political power and wealth. To situate this history, you need to understand imperialism. You need to understand colonialism, because the roots of these narratives whether they are in the sort of genteel bureaucratic processes that say that one set of populations is expendable and eliminatable and another needs to have a global system built around them, as in World Bank or IMF policies, or even in the deranged fantasies that are churned out by Breitbart or French or American fascist writers. They all share a historical root, which is that if you're going to roam the globe and take other people's stuff, you better build narratives to dehumanize them. And if you read your Gramsci, which actually everybody should, that's one that isn't just a pretentious reference. I think we can all admit that there's a fair amount of that. But the understanding of how hegemonic cultural products are created to correlate with material drives is exactly the type of integral synthesis we need right now to understand the interplay of these things, so that we're not unmoored from a systemic understanding of what contributes to white supremacy and right-wing terrorism. And then we're also not pivoting and just saying, well, no, it's not this mass murder. It's really the falling rate of profit. It's all of the above. It's a synthesis, and you need to play on all terrains and all fields, or you won't have a proper answer. So let's talk about that. The wealth of Europe and the United States was built off of the suffering and robbery of the rest of the world. Latin America was turned into a continent-wide mining operation. Indigenous peoples were slaughtered or forced into slavery, while the extraction of resources was distributed to the Spanish and Portuguese, exacerbated to paying off growing debts to the German, English, and French. The economist Ernest Mandel calculated that the robbery of Latin America, along with the money made in the slave trade, the pillage of Indonesia, and the extraction of Indian wealth by the British Crown, exceeds the capital invested in the Industrial Revolution in Europe. That's historicizing something. You can take whatever policy conclusion you want from that. The brilliant and always wrong right-wing African-American economist Glenn Loury says he recognizes something to the effect of he recognizes these atrocities, but he also doesn't think the modern world was possible without them. Well, I fundamentally, morally, and politically disagree, but I like the fact that he acknowledges and knows that history. Too many people you argue with on the right are living in a fantasy world, but they're not even playing with the same facts on the ground. These are the facts of any of these discussions. This is the baseline, period. Of these nations, and the capital invested in the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The capitalist, quote-unquote, success of these nations was paid for with the blood and treasure of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That's not a moral statement. That's a historical fact. That's reality. Along with these systems of exploitation and genocide that snatched land and resources from the rest of the world, racial mythologies and ideologies were propagated to justify the plunder. From American racism to Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden, these systems have been employed and encouraged to support these systems of exploitation. And that is why a broader and smarter conversation about something like reparations would not only deal on a cash transfer and policy level, but it would force an actual historical dealing with the fact, particularly, obviously, specifically the United States in that case, but I'm going to argue globally. How could you possibly have a foreign policy that does not have complete debt cancellation for the Caribbean? Haiti paid off France for liberating itself from the French running a slave colony. Let that sink in. It might be more powerful than a thought experiment. How we can fight them? On an individual level, we can show support and solidarity with each other and those who are threatened. We can challenge racism in our communities. We can educate ourselves about how these systems work and, frankly, try to develop empathy, compassion, and some, frankly, God forbid, sophistication as people. Generally, if you're doing that, you're actually more interesting, less of an asshole. And I'm not talking about performative wokeness and posturing on social media and showing how moral and clean you are. None of us are. And that's fine. That's part of the unevenness in dealing with human existence. But you do need to know these things, and you do need to have it incorporated in how you go about life in a real way. But real action is collective, and we need to fight to take political and economic. This is the most important thing, by the way. Hint, hint. We need to fight to take economic and political power from those who benefit from systems of imperialism and racism to recreate the world materially. And let's bring in Ilhan Omar, who is one of the great forces of positivity in modern politics. She advocates for an inclusive foreign policy that centers on human rights and justice and peace as pillars of America's engagement in the world, one that brings our troops home and truly makes military action a last resort. It means moving away from cliches and thoughts and prayers, and instead grappling with and dismantling the systems of imperialism and the capitalist system itself. And, you know, on a smaller level, let's go to the Shoutout. And we'll play, that was a great Mike Hanna report, but we'll use it in the post game. But let's get to the Shoutout, because here's a little bit of praxis.
I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shoutout. This is crazy. Shoutout. This is out of control. Shoutout. That's creepy. Shoutout. That's weird. Creepy. Weird.
And we are ruthless with the transition, so we can go from talking like that and then play that song. But we make it work. Shout out to Egg Boy. He egged, what is this fascist name?
Fraser Anning,
who, you know, look, this kid showed incredible courage and moxie to do this, and fuck that guy. And he punches this kid in the face. One of the things that's really mind-blowing to me is that even people, I mean, first of all, like, I was talking with Ben Burgess about this, and Ben Burgess was saying, like, one of the ways that he synthesizes the fact that he does not like deplatforming, and he thinks, and he's got, you know, critiques of various ways that the left engages in these things, but he also loves the fact that Richard Spencer got punched because he's a fully paid up member of the human race. So like all of us, he had the right response to that. And he said, well, I realize like part of the distinction is just like, you know, he didn't ask the college administration to punch Richard Spencer in the face. He did. So there's like a nice personal initiative here. And this kid...
I mean, I feel like this was all laid out in civil disobedience.
100%. I mean, this is obviously way more. I mean, this is just more like on the pieing and prank level. And this grown man, this senator, whose first response to the terrorism in New Zealand was to blame immigration, punches this kid in the face. So when you hear, and then one of his fucking thugs put this kid in a chokehold. So when you hear, like, you know, that little drumbeat of like, is this really the way? Just, you know, realize what that is an agent of. Because honestly, even if you wanted to hold the perspective of like, we should have complete peace and non-confrontation and so on, that's fine. But the only people who are saying that legitimately would start with the chokehold and the punch in the face, not the egg. So Egg Boy, though, is a hero of this show and the globe. Let's watch that.
Attacked in their own...
And this motherfucker. Yeah, and I like how he goes back at him. Like, listen, you old fuck, don't come at me.
And then the goons are...
And then the goons get this kid in a chokehold.
Like, yeah.
I don't know if we have the other angle. I don't know that we need to even play that. I think the kid is a hero. He deserves all of our respect.
He donated the money he received, I believe, to the Christchurch Mosque. So.
Yeah, he did.
He's done more in his life and contributed more than most ever will. This happened, I guess this was a while ago, but Brazil has an egg girl. And this was another great accomplishment in yoking another prominent fascist, Jair Bolsonaro. Let's check this out. Oh, that was beautiful. All right. So what we're going to do is we got to get to the pitch. Actually, you know what? Let's actually loop this quickly before we go to the pitch. Let's just play quickly this Mike Hanna segment. We have a minute. This is Mike Hanna, of course, friend and regular of the show, his report on American Muslim responses to Christchurch. And again, you know, just underlining the obvious point, Donald Trump, just as the terrorist who committed that action wrote in his manifesto, this guy at the very least is a cultural agent of this terrorism. And it's reflected in this. We'll just play about a minute of this report from Mike Hanna on Al Jazeera.
It was a somber day of prayer for American Muslims, all expressing sorrow for those who died in the New Zealand mosque attacks.
I'm absolutely heartbroken, as everybody is today. I woke up to the news. My phone was blowing up with this, and I needed to come to Jummah prayer.
But in a nation that has seen its share of attacks on houses of worship, there's concern about what many view as sometimes inflammatory comments that are uttered by the president.
I actually think that the Islamophobic rhetoric that exists from the White House is very much ignites responses that causes events like these to happen around the world.
A message driven home by this Muslim leader.
Mr. Trump, your words matter. Your policies matter. They impact the lives of innocent people at home and globally.
And of course, Trump doesn't care and his base doesn't care. But what's important about communicating that is like that poll number that I think something like less than 20% of Americans think that Donald Trump doesn't like white supremacy. And obviously, it should be 0%. He is what he is. It's objectively obvious. But when you have people who are frankly, good spokespeople for being real, who know how to come across well in a public setting, saying, look, this is what it is. Who do you actually want to be identified with as a person? Do you want to be identified with this grotesque monster in the White House who distracts from or subtly encourages this or indirectly encourages this, or the actual terrorists themselves, or that spokesperson or that woman at the mosque? Who do you actually want to identify with here? And this is another thing that is completely out of all of this, new atheist nonsense of like, oh, I can't criticize religion. Yes, you can criticize religion. And if you haven't been able to connect the dots and see that focusing particularly and extraordinarily on Islam in this environment with these policy sets, with this complete ahistoricity of that subject, that you haven't fed into and helped create this climate, well, you're not a primary cause, but you're a factor. And if you're denying it, you're fucking delusional. Delusional. Or intentionally ill-intentioned. All right. Now, this will be a little bit awkward because now we're going to do the pitch. But it's been a heavy week. Guys, let's start first and foremost by... Actually, you know what, David? Do the pitch, man. Hit it. Come on, you got it. You got this. You got this.
We keep on growing each week. We're getting more and more people in our community, and it's a good thing. We have such a rich well to dig into. When you go onto our Patreon, we have illicit histories. We have all this deep dives into the history of the left, which is so... It's incredible how much stuff we've put up there already, and we're keep on doing more each week. So definitely, if you're already a Patreon, you should really be combing through that. And I'm hopefully going to be trying to do more to make that more accessible for people. But it's all out there. We're putting out new content each week. We have 3 readings on Monday. We have the post game. We're always hanging out after the show. We got our new live show coming up in LA. April
well, that's
20th.
What we got to get to next.
Yeah.
Let me just say, of course, at the 21 and above level, Vic Vienna's. We're doing the video illicit histories, which will be, if you join that, you're helping us make it happen, and you'll get it first, and you can give us ideas and subjects. And then, at the end of the day, we're going to try to distribute most of those as broadly as possible because we want people to know the content. Get your tickets now to the Bootleg Theater, April 20th, the TMBS live show in Los Angeles, Left is Best West Coast Fest, with Nando Vila. Nando Vila, host for Fusion, writer for Splinter at different times, documentary filmmaker, but he also writes for The Athletic on soccer. He hosted the World Cup series for Gimlet. The guy is the dapper socialist. He's a bon vivant. He's awesome. He's going to be there. Anna Kasparian. I mean, come on. How many people at Anna and our ages in general get to our, she's a legend. She's the fucking boss. I guess not literally, but, in my mind, frankly, the boss of TYT.
Do they do many live events? I know, Jimmy Dore show does, but does TYT...
I don't know, actually.
How often do you get a chance to see
I think it's a very rare chance to see the great Anna Kasparian live, and obviously along with Nando, we're super stoked that we get to do a lot of work with her. She's amazing. She's awesome. And then Big Wosny Lambre, who today, Count the Dings just announced The Athletic has acquired them, which is incredibly exciting. All of their great basketball and sports podcasts, which everybody should check out. Woz really is one of my best friends. And
he's the best NBA podcaster.
He's the best NBA podcaster. He's a brilliant political analyst. He's a hilarious guy. He's a good dude. He's entertaining as hell. If you saw the Count the Dings live show in Brooklyn with Woz and I up on stage, that was you would want to see us on stage. It will be highly entertaining. And also, I would go take this opportunity to go over to the Bomb feed on iTunes and make sure you subscribe to the Black Opinions Matter feed. Black Opinions Matter Monday, and then Woke Bros with Woz and I on Thursday. Last week, we talked about Vibes Cartel, the college admissions scandal, and we recently gave you the answer to how to deal with Michael Jackson, but also the Manafort charges, U.S. relationship to Haiti, Schoolboy Q, what else have we talked about? Why are Boston sports fans such assholes? I mean, we're having an incredible time there, and you will have an incredible time at the LA show at the Bootleg Theater, April 20th. I always say this. I mean, look, we're about halfway gone, so if it's the same pace as the Bell House, this will sell out because there's less tickets there.
Yeah, just do it right now.
Just do it right now. The Bell House was like just. I think we might have actually ended up selling it out day of, to be honest with you. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I do know, I think there's about 50 less seats maybe. So it is like a real difference. So just don't wait. Grab your tickets. We'll see you there. Bootleg Theater, April 20th. Patreon.com/TMBS. If this is the first time you're watching it, welcome. Hey, what's up? Subscribe to the channel. We got a lot of clips for you. All right. We've got basically like a kind of prolonged global update to get to. And we're going to start with Jair Bolsonaro's visit to Washington. And I don't know, I guess we only took clips from the Fox interview, but we really should, maybe see while I'm doing this, if we can get anything from the meeting with Trump. And do we also have the clip, guys, of the Real News Report on the CIA visit? I thought you put that in there, Griscom, right? That's Argentina. So I'll just set this up a little bit. So Jair Bolsonaro is in Washington. And in a very unusual and bizarre move, he and Sergio Moro actually visited CIA headquarters, which is, I mean, we talk a lot about subtext becoming text in the Trump era, and that's some pretty wild and intense subtext becoming text there. It's no question that more broadly, and I think, again, the key tipping point actually is 2009 when the Obama administration backed the coup in Honduras that removed Manuel Zelaya. That, I think, actually was the kind of pivotal turning point in we are going to reverse this pink tide thing. And we're not going to make distinctions anymore. We're not going to distinguish between, Chavez is the enemy and Cuba's the enemy, but obviously someone like Lula we could maybe deal with, or someone like, the Kirchners or somewhere in between. This was the project of we're done with this. And that's how you get this broad, sweeping corruption investigation. I've talked about Lava Jato and Ulterbrecht in terms of Brazil a lot, but this is actually an investigation that has hit other left-wing leaders in Peru and across the region. And again, I think it's pretty obvious and pretty evident that why does this investigation only hit the left? And why is a process that basically is finding out sometimes some extreme cases of personal extravagance, and other cases in Lula, nothing in terms of material evidence, but is mostly just showing you, like Latin America, like the United States, there's a huge amount of corporate influence and campaign funding. And they might be less bureaucratized than we are, but this is the same thing. There is no difference functionally in what most of these investigations have yielded than the Washington, D.C. process of get a campaign contribution and someone gets more, gets hooked up with contracts, and then you get a lobbying job. In fact, far more systemic in Washington, D.C., and without some of the public side benefit that you might see under the leadership of a center-left government. So that's happening. Now you have these far-right forces in Latin America, and I have no doubt that the meeting at the CIA is all about Venezuela. The Trump administration is still trying to instigate something there. And in the postgame, we have a terrifying clip of a military operative on Fox News, basically, again, just sort of openly musing about assassinating Maduro. Not only did Jair Bolsonaro go to the CIA and meet with Donald Trump, he, of course, last night got a sit down on the prime fascist propaganda network of the United States and therefore the world, Fox News. And he started, let's start with the first clip, which is on his feelings about socialism.
Said everything is on the table with respect to the U.S. What role, if any, do you see the Brazilian military playing in this conflict?
This is actually clearly about Venezuela. So this is him on Venezuela. Go ahead.
Our president has said everything is on the table with respect to the U.S. What role, if any, do you see the Brazilian military playing in this conflict in Venezuela, or not at all?
Trump did mention all possibilities. We, in turn, cannot talk about all possibilities because we do face certain constraints. However, whatever is realistically possible on the diplomatic front by way of assistance or aid in such a way as to ensure that the U.S. can overcome this issue. The one country that is most interested in putting an end to Maduro's drug trafficking dictatorship is Brazil. So today we have a new ideology, a new approach as adopted in Brazil, and we feel very much obliged to seek out a more appropriate alternative so as to ensure that Venezuela can go back to peace, democracy, and liberty.
So he's repeating all of the pablum of the administration, and clearly, again, there's military bases opening in Brazil. All of the primitive accumulation of things like opening up the Amazon to foreign investment. This is a totally subservient government to U.S. interests. However, the Brazilian military is concerned about military conflict with Venezuela because they have a significantly less powerful military. And if the hemisphere turns into a multi-sided civil war with multiple insurgencies and a U.S. presence and potentially even a Russian presence, well, we'll watch it from our TVs, but the Brazilians will actually have to deal with it. Here he is, though, echoing Trump as well on socialism. And again, the difference is that this guy is in a position, Trump gets to say, lock her up. This guy does have his main political rival, who is also the country's best president historically, literally locked up. Here he is talking about socialism.
So what do you say to people here in the U.S. who look at socialism and have a favorable assumption about it, that they see something positive there?
Well, I see President Trump fighting that trend, and I couldn't agree more with him. I think he's right. And to a certain extent, we're doing very much the same thing in Brazil. I think it is fair to say that, the American people who think about socialism should look at the experience of France, where borders were open to receive refugees without any kind of sorting or filter, if you will. And having open borders, in my view, is absolutely poor a decision. It is not at all a good decision. We do agree with President Trump's decision or proposal on the wall.
Bolsonaro had to apologize after saying also that most Brazilians that come to the United States don't have good intentions, which is an incredible thing to say about literally your own people. And he had to do I misspoke. Now, again, I think props to Glenn Greenwald. Glenn's a friend, and I respect a lot of his work, and I also totally disagree with his attitude towards Tucker Carlson. There's a thing called cognitive dissonance, holding multiple thoughts. So I have strong disagreements with Glenn about Tucker as a platform, some aspects of Russia, the difference between Clinton and Trump, whatever. I also think he's a great journalist who has done and continues to do a lot of really important analysis, and I'm able to hold all of that. And one of the things he's done is actually use this platform. There's a clip of him. We'll just play this briefly. I mean, Laura Ingraham is not ready for this. And again, the frame here, yes, you might not like the contrast in terms of, Trump has fake scandals. This is a real scandal. But I'll tell you that Fox News, they were not ready and excited to hear about Bolsonaro's gang ties 40 minutes before his primetime sit-down.
To go. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, where I know you know, we've been working on an expose about some really incredibly criminal acts on the part of the Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro, who's in Washington this week.
Yes, he's here.
To meet with Donald Trump, and there you, and there you, and actually he's going to be on Shannon Bream's show next, I believe. There you see like what a real scandal looked like. He's only been in office for 2 months. There's incredible amounts of concrete, tangible evidence that has been publicly disclosed, linking him to the world's worst paramilitary gangs and extrajudicial murderers in the country. That's what a real scandal looks like. Instead.
So. Anyways, so Greenwald and also Greenwald's, and again, they've been reporting this aggressively at The Intercept, the incredibly deep connections, literally physically, between Bolsonaro and the cartel that assassinated Marielle Franco. And I think in addition to that comment, the Intercept team pushed their contacts at Fox, and this actually made its way into this interview.
But I want to give you a chance to answer those who are questioning whether you had any link to that murder.
I am a former Brazilian army captain, and the military police officers in Rio de Janeiro, to a large extent, are good friends of mine. By coincidence, one of these alleged killers of my Marielle police officers wasn't really a neighbor of mine. I mean, he lived on the opposite side of the other street. But of course, the media that has always criticized me, they wanted to establish a clear connection. But I've never saw that gentleman in my gated community. I spend a lot of time outside the gated community. I don't really spend that much time to, engage in social life with them. I only learned he lived there after the article became public. My stepdaughter did seem to know someone. They even tried to say that my youngest boy, who is currently a 20-year-old boy, may have dated the man's young lady or young daughter. I asked him, did you date her? And he said, well, I dated just about every girl in the gated community. I can't remember her. If you show me the picture, I can possibly see who she is. I only learned about Marielle Franco after she was killed. She was a councilwoman, and I had never ever heard anything about her life. And one further point, what kind of motivation could I possibly have to be the mastermind of some kind of murder like that? I didn't even know.
Oh, okay. So this is incredible. So right, you're absolutely right. There was a cut after that super fucking tasteless comment about being like, how can my son keep track? He fucked everybody in the building. While literally, I mean, again, just to remind us, and I know we all have like unlimited cynicism, but this is a head of state who has tangible connections to a cartel that assassinated a city councilor, and he's turning a denial into a joke about his son's sexual prowess, okay? And again, I'm sure that plays very well with a certain part of the base. But let's be real here. Now, the question has never been, did Jair Bolsonaro order a hit on Marielle Franco? The question is, are you connected, or is your family connected to the gang that did the hit? And the other part that he didn't mention is the reporting that came out several weeks ago about the cash transfers to his son's bank account, which Sergio Moro, his justice minister, who put Lula in jail with zero evidence, has said, oh, I'm not interested in that evidence. Add to which that he was the only presidential candidate, including the sitting right-wing president, Michel Temer, who all said this. They all went through the motions of saying this was terrible. He didn't say anything, and there's a photo of one of his sons tearing up one of her campaign posters after she was assassinated. And he kind of gave it away there by saying, I'm close with the Rio police, who are some of the most notorious violent police in the planet. And there's a symbiotic relationship between them and the drug and mafia cartels, who often are staffed up with ex-police and military who did this hit. And then the other reason why is he ran a campaign explicitly advocating greater ease for police to murder people in a place that already has hugely high police murder rates. So that's Jair Bolsonaro. I don't know if do we have anything that we could grab from Twitter of him and Trump just for a second, and then we'll get to the other stuff. But they had a friend of mine on Twitter who's a patron and a Democratic consultant, he said, he was on board, but he said, after watching Trump and Bolsonaro affirm their ideological and strategic ties. He's like, it really underlined how important the free Lula dimension is, because this travesty is the through line of all of it. And it's also a great example of how the kind of nerdy, wonk accommodationist nonsense that never understands power and never understands strategy and never understands ruthlessness is sitting there going like, oh, I don't know, I've heard bad stuff about Lula, without seeing like how this whole process played out, going back to a judicial coup that removed Dilma Rousseff. This is what it leads to, you idiots. And again, it's extraordinary, because these are the same people that actually will defend someone like Hillary Clinton when she frankly deserves no defense. But I would be the first one to tell you, and I did tell you in 2016, some of those corruption narratives about Hillary Clinton were total fucking bullshit. And that even where she was, you needed to block a fascist from entering the White House. Now, I would never insult Lula by comparing him to Hillary Clinton. There's totally different worlds of quality of leadership there, obviously. But like, if you could understand that on behalf of a corporatist who has increased poverty, maybe you could understand it on behalf of a heroic social democrat who brought 40 million people out of poverty. This is Bolsonaro and Trump.
Is offering the access.
Well, we're looking at it very strongly. We're very inclined to do that. The relationship that we have right now with Brazil has never been better. I think there was a lot of hostility with other presidents. There's zero hostility with me. And we're going to look at that very, very strongly in terms of whether it's NATO or it's something having to do with alliance. But we have a great alliance with Brazil, better than we've ever had before.
Now, what's funny is, like, of course, Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. But yes, there was some hostility because the Snowden leaks revealed that the Obama administration was aggressively tapping on spying on Dilma, who was, in fact, a friendly government, except they wouldn't open up new oil reserves to U.S. companies and privatize some of their strategic assets. And that really is, just in terms of a timeline, that is when the DOJ aggressively backs Lava Jato and going easy on Lula and the Workers' Party and Dilma stops. That's just the timeline. And just continue on in Brazil for another couple of minutes. There's just two other pieces of important news to get to. This is a report from Michael Fox, who does great reporting at the Real News Network. There is a new movement building in Brazil to free Lula. And I just want you to take this in because, again, not only is this hugely innately important, but people here who might be responding to the onslaught of horror of the Bolsonaro regime, who still want to disconnect it from the broader political struggle of both Lula's imprisonment and the Workers' Party, you cannot do that. Like, if you want actual solidarity with the Brazilian left, they're saying this is part and parcel of what we're dealing with. Our main candidate, most popular politician in the country, was jailed without evidence and has been held on solitary confinement. That led to the rise. That was the final paving of a Bolsonaro regime and the Wall Street State Department agenda. This is the clip from the Real News.
We in the Brazilian Association of Lawyers for Democracy have been following this case for a long time, from the very beginning, with lawyers from across the country. And we consider both rulings against Lula to be complete judicial aberrations. There is no evidence against Lula.
A free Lula vigil has been ongoing outside the federal prison in Curitiba, where Lula has been held since last April. There are committees dedicated to fighting for Lula's freedom in many cities, but those at the event called for the expansion of free Lula committees around the country.
It's clear that we have to develop and root our organization with the free Lula committees, not only to defend President Lula's innocence, but also to create a huge mass of activists to fight against the policies destroying the country that are being implemented right now.
In addition to that, in a great act of international labor solidarity, the AFL-CIO awarded Lula its 2019 George Meany and Lane Kirkland Human Rights Award on March 14, 2019. We'll put it up on screen. I'll quote from it briefly. As a migrant, a worker, a union leader, and a political visionary, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva spent his life fighting for democracy and the rights of workers and excluded communities in Brazil. As president, from 2003 through 2010, Lula led millions out of poverty and increased access to higher education, housing for poorer citizens. He became a leader revered worldwide by those who believe in a sustainable global economy rests on prosperity being broadly shared. The AFL-CIO therefore honors Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva with its annual George Meany Lane Kirkland Human Rights Award. In his commitment to increasing access to a decent life and basic rights as widely as possible, Lula has been faithful to his origins of the poor in the northeast of Brazil, where he grew up before migrating to São Paulo with his mother and 7 brothers and sisters. As the head of the Metal Workers Union in the 1970s, he led workers who confronted Brazil's dictatorship to democratize the workplace and unions. Lula was a crucial figure in the broad alliance of mass social movements, artists, intellectuals, women and men, and Brazilians of all races that brought democracy back to Brazil in 1985. And just scroll down a bit. It goes on to more about the successes of his presidency. But then they say, and this is also a shame for The Guardian, The New York Times, and everybody else who has covered this case so dishonestly, so credulously, so elitistly, stupidly in the United States. These elites, these privileged elites, have undermined Brazil's fragile democratic institutions, especially its judiciary, and took extraordinary legal measures to prevent Lula from running for president in October 2018, when all polls predicted his victory. Since April 8th, 2018, Lula has been a political prisoner convicted of, and this is a quote, this is literally what he's convicted of, unspecified official acts, with only plea bargain testimony as evidence against him. In defense of Lula of Brazil's constitution, he's been in prison in defiance of Brazil's constitution, he's been in prison while his appeals are still pending, blocked from receiving visitors, though that privilege is allowed to many other prisoners, and prevented from attending his brother's funeral. Although Brazil grants thousands of such bereavement leaves each month. In fact, Lula had more access to rights when he was arrested for his activism during the 70s dictatorship than he has in today's Brazil. Lula's crime is having the audacity to take well more than 30 million people out of poverty and challenge the privileges of the powerful elite. I'll tweet that out again. I recommend everybody read that statement. All right, let's get to Argentina. And next week, I'll get to Sudan, Algeria, and South Africa. And maybe we'll do Yemen in the post-game. So in 2001, there was riots in Argentina because there was a economic crisis created by the IMF World Bank policies that had plundered Argentina and sent it into an economic crisis. Then the Kirchners came into power. Nestor Kirchner first, then Cristina Kirchner. I'll be honest, I know less about Argentina than Brazil, as an example. I know that the Kirchners basically told the IMF and the World Bank to get lost, which was excellent. And they introduced Keynesian policies that stabilized Argentina and invested in the middle class and decreased poverty, and they were part of the pink tide. There was also a huge amount of bottom-up social organizing and workplace democracy that took place in Argentina in this period. Right now, Cristina Kirchner, who's in the Senate and has immunity because of that, there's the same process happening in Argentina right now to try to bar her from running for the presidency. There's a lot of Lula similarities. Now, I know less about that case, but if you don't see a pattern, we're talking about former presidents who represent the center left of some variety or another, who are being not allowed or attempted to not be allowed to run by a pliant judiciary on behalf of far-right leaders, in this case Macri, president of Argentina, who was elected a couple years ago. What does that trend tell you? Now, we'll get to more of that later, but let's just take this report in a second from Al Jazeera, because one of the frames you will always hear in U.S. media, anytime a populist of any variety in Latin America, any variety, including, Lula, for God's sake, who when they covered back in his prime, they all were giving him all sorts of credit for Brazil's great economic performance. But Kirchner or Chavez or whoever, well, these populists came in and they ruined the economy. Well, for who? I know that there was literally a private equity investor that had Argentina in court in the United States to freeze government assets. That stopped after Macri came into power because he was willing to reset economic policy along World Bank and IMF lines. They're back in Argentina. So the economy is flourishing, right? Well, maybe not. Check this report out.
Across Argentina, tens of thousands of people took their anger and frustration to the streets in a day of protest against cuts to benefits. They blocked access roads and here in Buenos Aires demonstrated outside supermarkets. The protests come in the midst of rising prices and continued job losses.
It's very, very bad. We're seeing more poverty, more people at the soup kitchens. The truth is, the money doesn't buy anything. There's not enough to eat.
Industrial production is down, unemployment and poverty levels are up. Vehicle sales are half what they were this time last year, and all the major car plants are suspending workers. Inflation continues at more than 30% a year, while the peso falls against the US dollar. Many analysts say President Mauricio Macri's policies are not working.
Clearly, the opening up of the economy, the deregulation, the opening up to speculative capital flows, everything that Macri has done has only sunk the economy into the pit. And so that has to be reversed.
So there you have it. Now, again, World Bank and IMF policies work what they're designed to do. That's a natural byproduct. If you starve the public sector and you rewrite regulation to favor foreign direct investment and multinationals, that's going to increase poverty, hurt labor unions, and yes, ultimately harm purchasing power. That's true. There is both the broader socialist case against an economy that is designed to disempower most people, and then there's also a Keynesian argument, which is if you do these things, you will not have a consumer class, and that will undermine the economy. I think in today's political phase, as you know, markets reach their limits, literally in terms of what are new things available to create markets around. You see a new phase. I mean, Africa's an area because there's a lot of natural resources there that can still be destroyed. And then here it's more and more abstract, right? Like, oh, well, what if it was a place where you ordered food, but you also got a book recommendation? This kind of silly tech economy stuff. But on the basic level of how you balance that out, the options are getting more and more limited. And the answer to the right, from the right, is going to be, well, go ahead, go protest. There's no reason, no mistake that Macri is deploying new military-oriented policing methods that supposedly focus on drug cartels, but will no doubt have major implications for any other sources of organizing or power. So that's, again, just like in the opening commentary, that's how the economics and the capital flows connect with every other category of repression. And this is, these guys are showing you the game right now. It's really clear. And we got to stop with all this, toxic nonsense in our own ranks and get focused on what's really going on here, because this is serious. I mean, this is a play for keeps time. And it's always been, clearly for certain communities more than others, obviously. But this also is a global play for keeps time. All right. Richard Wolff is coming back on April 16th. Are you going to be in studio, David?
Of course.
Oh, of course, huh? You got the balls to be in studio?
I never run.
You never run, huh? Did you see that fan art where Richard Wolff beheaded you?
I'll be honest. I don't know.
That was a little disturbing. That was. I would just like to say, actually, as a serious point, tone it down a little bit. I think more of this sort of Scorsese thing works.
Well, I just wasn't prepared for how I felt after seeing my head ripped off of my body.
That was a lot. That was a lot. I think a nice solid punch in Griscom's jaw would get the point across. Without further ado, it's the Griscom Economic Minute.
Yeah, well, I mean,
David Griscom.
You know, after what you were talking about, it flows pretty well. You know, we talk about these tech companies like Lyft and Uber, and a lot of the innovation that's going on in the U.S. economy has been primarily about ways to find ways to monopolize already existing economic activities. So we're looking at Lyft, which they're going into their IPO coming up.
Right.
There's going to be about 10 major tech companies this year that looks like they're coming up. So it's going to be a very, very big year for IPOs. And right now they're targeting a $23 billion valuation. Despite this, though, the founders are still going to have majority control of the company, even though they won't be owning the majority of the stock. And let's just talk about a company like Lyft, which does a bunch of stuff that's pretty shady. One, they continue to categorize their employees as independent contractors. Two, they are yet to make anything resembling a profit. Actually, in fact, last year, they had nearly $1 billion in losses. And they've been preparing the market for this realization. But they're coming out first out of this big wave of IPOs because they want to get ahead of their competition, primarily Uber. You know, Uber is another company. They're going to be going for a $120 billion valuation. In 2018, their losses were $1.8 billion. And primarily, this is all money that's being spent to subsidize rides so that they can charge a lower price than taxi companies or any other kind of competition. So we're seeing the way that capitalism is sort of cannibalizing itself, wherein we're just having a few companies trying to find ways to lower their prices artificially and then hopefully being able to inflate them, which is something that is very likely to happen on a large scale once these companies become public and you start having people who invested lots of money wanting to get paid. But getting paid is the point, and that's why a lot of these companies are going into going into IPOs, because it's a great payday for the founders and the early investors and the early employees. And they're going to be trying to get over something that looks like it's going to be happening in 2019, which is going to be a very significant slowdown. We have the Fed meeting tomorrow, and we'll see what happens with the interest rate. But because of the uncertainty around Brexit and the U.S.-China trade negotiations, along with low job growth actually over the past couple of months, and industrial production numbers are continually looking weak, and it's not just the United States. Even Germany has had to slash their growth forecast in the past couple of weeks. And what we're seeing right now is very much two different types of situations, wherein you have a few tech companies and a few small groups of people who have been profiting immensely from an economy that's really not working for most people. And you look at cities like San Francisco, and you really start to see the disparity between most Americans, because where most job growth is, where most people have opportunities now, is in service jobs, which tend to be lower wage. They tend to be in retail, hotel work, and healthcare. And then you have some super earners who are making ridiculous amounts of money. When the first IPOs hit San Francisco, when Facebook and Twitter hit their IPOs, there were 2,500 new millionaires made overnight. And you can only imagine what that does to housing prices in a place that's already very squeezed. So we're seeing, with Lyft is going up for an IPO, Uber is going for an IPO, Pinterest is going for an IPO. About 9 to 10 major tech companies are expected to, release IPOs later this year. Imagine how much that's going to hit an already tight labor market, a housing market. We've already seen just in the past couple of months, in expectation of the IPOs, that around 2,400 listings for houses in the area have been pulled down because people are just wanting to sit on that so that they can charge a lot more in the future. So people are being squeezed for their time, they're being squeezed for their life, and we need to really start paying attention and start talking much more seriously about the staggering disparity in our economy, and also the unsustainable way that we're allowing some people to profit on the backs of everyone else.
100%. That's exactly right. We need to take a brief break. Matt will have some sound drops for you. Sort of a auditory tour through all of the demented assholes that we have to hear on a daily basis. But with, of course, the great DJ Danerky in the background. Of course, as always, just want to, sometimes take some time to thank all of you. Much appreciated. On all levels. We had a bunch of new people coming through because, as an example, our buddy Kyle Kolinsky did a great, who of course, I know there's actually, traffic that goes the other way too, so I would check out Kyle if you haven't yet. He does a great show. He did a video on, did you play it again?
Competition would start kicking in.
He did a video about my I-24 appearance, which apparently was very cathartic for a lot of people. to watch me tear after that accent guy and defend Ilhan Omar. We all got to do that. Props to her. We're going to be talking more about that, and even I'm hearing some rumblings of some real bullshit coming from local Democratic Party hacks to try to undermine her. So we'll continue to have her back and keep her in Congress. We're going to take a couple of minutes, and Harvey J. Kaye and Daniel Bessner are going to join me right here, literally a couple feet from me. They've been sort of cuddling on the couch, so we're getting ready. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. All right, welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Sorry about that, folks. Having a bit of weird tech difficulties. Some of it is actually YouTube's fault, which is interesting, but that wasn't YouTube's fault. I don't know what fault that was. Why are we so worried about assigning blame anyways, man?
It's a camera fault.
Camera fault. There's also something weird going on with this computer, too, which I don't understand, but we'll look at that before the post game. Joining us now is Professor Harvey J. Kaye. He is the author of so many books, I could not possibly mention them all. I'm reading his British Historians book right now, which is brilliant. British Marxist Historians, which is brilliant. He's also the author of The Four Freedoms. And what's the name of
Thomas Paine and the Promise of America?
Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. Get on the mic, though, sir.
Sorry.
Harvey Kaye, returning champion. Thank you for being here. And another returning champion, Daniel Bessner. He's the author of Hans Speyer. Cuck. No, I'm just kidding. He's the author of Hans Speyer and the Defense of Democracy.
Rise of the Defense Intellectuals.
The Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. And he's also the Pyle Professor at the University of Washington, where he piles it on.
Piles it on, teach the youth.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. All right, I'm going to go back.
He just got tenure.
Well, congratulations. Is my board up?
Thank you.
Say, baby, put down that pipe and get
Wait, Daniel. This was done specifically for your obnoxious humor. So can you both of you put on your headphones and listen to my congratulations sound effect? Congratulations on tenure, Daniel.
Say, baby, put down that pipe and get my pipe up.
I appreciate that.
Bill O'Reilly welcomes you to the Academy.
Great
sir.
man. Yeah.
No, but congratulations. That's a great accomplishment. I want to actually, both of you, because I think that if I had, if I wasn't dyslexic and I didn't have all sorts of, financial and emotional issues in my 20s, I might have, and also, frankly, I was, less rebellious. There were some positive traits here, too. But one only...
Are you saying we weren't rebellious?
No, you guys were fucking reading like nerds. No, I'm just kidding. Of course you were.
That's
I actually think, like, when I think of parallel, like, other things I could do, it's not that many. So, one, it's like the evil version. I think I would be great at crisis communications. I think I would be, like, an excellent, like, sort of Tony Blair-like figure jetting around the world defending dictatorships. I think I would do very well at that. And I also could potentially see a type of law. And the only other thing that I could plausibly see would be some type of historian. So I like an enormous amount of admiration and almost wistfulness about historians. So I'm really curious, could you guys both just respectively tell us how you became historians, what the path was? We'll start with Professor Kaye.
And it's appropriate that we're in Brooklyn.
Yes.
Because I may have mentioned this to you before. My grandparents lived on Eastern Parkway here in Brooklyn.
Right.
And this actually connects to Thomas Paine and history.
Perfect.
Okay.
Go.
So my grandfather, my grandmother, my father's side lived on Eastern Parkway right opposite the Brooklyn Museum. I was maybe 9, 10 years old. That would have been 49, late 50s. And I used to love going across to the Brooklyn Museum. Yep. And I think I can't remember if I told you this. There was an unwrapped mummy.
You've told me this story, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, sorry, yeah, no,
Tell all
right.
of them.
Yeah, and the Brooklyn Museum, everyone said, oh, did you really like art as a kid? No, it was the fact that they had this Egyptology collection that included an unwrapped mummy. And imagine you're 9 years old. I mean, you could just go and just stand there the entire time wondering about it. So anyhow, when I couldn't get over to the museum, if nobody was around to take me, I would wander my grandparents' apartment as if it was, a museum or gallery. And my grandfather was a trial lawyer in Manhattan, but he would keep his personal books at home. And in the back of the dining room, which, as I tell everyone, I can see it distinctly, he had these books, history and politics and that kind of thing. And when I sat down on the floor, I was at this shelf, which is all Thomas Paine books, one of which actually was a book that argued that Thomas Paine was the real author of the Declaration of Independence, which was, of course, bullshit. but that's okay. It was in a book, and I believed it. So,
right.
Yeah, we were nerds, I suppose.
Yeah.
So
it
anyhow,
almost sounds like a little bit early, almost like Est training or postmodernism, because it didn't matter if it was true.
Right.
The action of
please
that
don't
truth.
Consider me a postmodern. Never. Don't.
No. This is
his
like
generation, not mine.
This is good.
No,
but
my generation.
You might have done Est, though.
Yeah.
Come on, that was trendy in the '70s. Don't
that
lie.
That sounds like a California thing. So forget that.
No,
okay?
well, it was a
because the
California
Dodgers
thing.
went.
Right. The Dodgers went to L.A. So fuck Est.
Yeah. So
okay, go ahead.
So I discovered Thomas Paine in my grandfather's apartment, and somehow I think it all flowed from that, as well as the fact that he used to read to me as an even smaller boy from Old Testament Bible stories, and wove them together with stories of growing up on the Lower East Side in Manhattan, and a whole question of persecution and exodus and rebellion. So I'm convinced my grandfather implanted not only a sort of interest in the past, but also a sense that history was about struggle.
What is the name of tonight's show? Speaking of which,
what is that?
What do we entitle tonight's
Winning
show?
the Future with History.
Oh,
there you go.
Very good.
That's see how that works.
Right. How'd you get into
fucking brain trust?
How did I get into it? Well, I think there's two major ways, and the first one kind of makes me look like a loser. But in terms of radical honesty, a girl broke up with me in high school, and I retreated into like trying to be smart, and I read a ton of history of the Nazis. So I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and I really found it. Yeah, it's a real thick book. I found it really compelling, and that really sparked. I was trying to be, get over my heartbreak by being smarter than everyone. Kind of pathetic. But the second one was that after college, I worked a job, a retail job, at a company called Steve & Barry's, which is...
I know Steve & Barry's. One of my best friend's sons was working there.
What is Steve & Barry's?
It was
okay.
I
could
feel
get
like
into
I know
it.
what it is, but what does it do?
It was a
closed?
retail company. Yeah, it was closed. It was a retail company that sold like very cheap clothing, but they would basically they expanded too quickly and basically collapsed after the 2008 crisis.
Actually, if I could just intervene.
Yes, please. Yes.
So Steve & Barry had a philosophy.
Yes.
They only hired Ivy League graduates.
Yes.
Oh my god!
I was about to. Yeah. So.
That is so obnoxious.
The scheme was...
It was a pyramid scheme.
It was a scheme. It was a...
this is great.
It was a scheme. So what they did was they would hire Ivy League graduates who with no experience. So you had a company being run by a bunch of 23-year-olds who didn't know anything, getting paid $35,000 a year. That very successfully ran the company into the ground within 2 or 3 years, effectively. But I had worked there for about 6 months, and I realized I didn't want to work a 9 to 5.
Right.
And so academia was one of the ways to escape the type of capitalist economy. And I mean, I did enjoy history, of course, but I didn't want to.
You never met Colin Lockhart, did you?
I did. He was the head of HR, I think.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Could be. It could be.
I think I. Yeah,
Don't get him.
He's my friend's son. I mean, he was.
Don't get him started on Colin Lockhart. We should not.
This is so funny.
Yeah,
I never thought I'd hear ever again about Steve & Barry.
Yeah. Well.
So. Okay, so then what we're gonna do here too. Okay, I like that place setting, and I want, first of all, let's start with one of the key bailiwicks here that you bring, Professor Kaye, and obviously, and I want to connect it with one of your key bailiwicks, which is bringing democracy to foreign policy. But can you start? And I don't even want to get into. We've had people can go into the archives, and I think there's a great debate that maybe we'll get to a little bit in the post game about exceptionalism or non-exceptionalism and all of this. We can get to that. That's fine. But there's actually an empirical point here, which is that America, in addition to being all of the things that I outlined in the opening commentary and having, being run by reactionaries, including right now, also has a very, there's also other elements of American history that are very progressive. Even as an example, the civil rights movement was a radical movement. It wasn't just a movement for vital civic reform. It was also It was across the board. And then going back to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine fits clearly in the radical tradition.
He is the godfather of American radical.
Okay, so maybe talk about that. How did Ronald Reagan specifically, as a microcosm of how the right has totally distorted our progressive history and use how they abused Thomas Paine's legacy?
Yeah, well, I can start with the specific story of Ronald Reagan grabbing hold of Thomas Paine.
Yeah, please do that.
I was fascinated by this. So in 1980, when he was running for president on the and won the Republican nomination, he was quoting Thomas Paine on the campaign trail. What's amazing about it is that liberal Democrats, ever since Roosevelt, had rediscovered Thomas Paine and quoted him. But they quoted, "These are the times that try men's souls." They quoted something having to do with, in the Cold War, these are these times, right? But Reagan did something that Democrats had not done. The only left-leaning figure that I've really come across in the post-war period who actually embraced the line I'm about to cite is Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
And that line is, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And I came to that, to King's using the line after my book was published, so it's not in the book. And it was a great thrill to come across it. So the thing is, Reagan grabbed hold of it, and then I had this question in my head. Now I'm going to talk, I know you don't want to talk about archives, and I'm not going to talk about archives, but it was, to me, I am a historian, and I had to find out where the fuck...
No, please talk about that.
Where the fuck Ronald Reagan would ever come upon Thomas Paine and do that. And I actually had my theories included this. During World War II, when he was still an FDR Democrat, there was a novel published by Howard Fast, Citizen Paine, okay?
Right.
And it became a bestseller. It was a really big bestseller in 1943. And I think it was in the wake of that best-selling, that book appearing, that Fast became a member of the Communist Party. But the interesting thing is that Reagan was very, very interested in popular history. Everyone I spoke to who knew Reagan told me that he loved reading history, not academic history.
So he was sort of like the way Tony Soprano would watch the History Channel with a Sunday.
I guess,
he was a great general.
Yeah,
that type of thing.
But that's probably, that was the first theory I had.
Right.
And I have kind of regretted that I didn't have the money to fly out to California and check his library. Okay. But then the next thing was, in the 1960s, he narrated a record on American history, especially sort of American era revolutionary history. And I did listen to that, and there's no mention of Thomas Paine, so it wasn't there. But the third theory I had was that somebody inserted it, into his life. So and the reason I say that is, can I introduce Barry Goldwater into this?
Of course.
Barry Goldwater's 1964 convention address accepting the Republican nomination, the one they prepared for him, he didn't like. So they called in a guy named Harry Jaffa. You know the name Harry Jaffa?
Yeah,
it's one of the sort of, the neocons went in different directions, so he's one of those kind of guys. He died not too long ago at an old age. He was head of the godfather of the Claremont Institute in Southern California.
Oh, okay. That's actually a pretty well-known right-wing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
The shocking thing about the Claremont, just for the record, is that they've gone pro-Trump, which most neocons are the never-Trumpsters, I guess.
I think you will find, along with Eric Erickson and Glenn Beck, that whole category is going to basically disappear as we get into 2020.
Yeah, sorry, I'm using.
There's no market left.
For
those guys,
right.
And even Frum is spending half of his time indirectly saying, well, Trump's rude, but you should embrace his most obscene policies.
Yeah.
So
and David Brooks endorsed reparations.
Right. Well, that's the opposite end.
Yeah. Okay.
But yes.
But having said that, so Goldwater, they called in this guy, Harry Jaffa.
That whole hustle's disappearing.
Who was then a political science professor at Ohio University. And he wrote the speech which said, I'm forgetting the line. What's the famous line? Help me out here.
The Thomas Paine line.
Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Is no vice.
Okay.
Right.
Now, that's not exact. So I interviewed Jaffa, because I could hear the echo from something Paine had written, and he said,
Did you throw an egg at him?
I did it on the phone.
Oh, okay, all right, fair enough. Then you're exempt.
But what's funny was
it's sort of
like
it was one of my it's like in the '80s with Iran. You saw Salman Rushdie.
Yeah, well, and you might get, it was one of my friends who actually worked at Weekly Standard. One of my friends who worked at Weekly Standard was the guy who introduced me to Jaffa. Jaffa didn't know my politics.
Right.
You wouldn't have talked to me otherwise.
Right.
So the thing is, and he said to me that he was looking for quotes, and he picked up Bartlett's ninth. It was like as
That's
simple
great. That's
as
such an
that.
Occam's
That was the
razor.
Barry.
It's
So the
great.
Barry Goldwater's famous line, right? Is
Right.
that okay? So now where's Reagan come into this? So I interviewed all of Reagan's speechwriters and the people who literally were his campaign people.
Right.
And one guy in particular, I think his name was Peter Hanrahan, who was very high up, going back to the California days, and he told me that Reagan really loved popular history, and I think he was reading one of the very conservative magazines when they'd go on a plane, and he would pick out quotes because he had the stump speech, but he would change things from city to city, and they were usually sitting first class, and he came upon this quote some point probably in the late 70s.
Right.
And just he loved it because he figured this was a way of sort of, giving it to the left.
Right.
He was going to be the one to quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And he most famously used it in the convention speech of 1980 when he accepted the nomination. And he really drove the historical line on that night because he quoted Lincoln, he quoted Paine, Lincoln, and Roosevelt.
Wow.
Yeah,
The balls.
And George Will was outraged that he would quote Paine because a conservative is supposed to quote Burke,
right,
not Paine. Okay, you can imagine the Roosevelt people were outraged because
Right.
he lifted Roosevelt's line without any reference to the meaning of it.
Right.
And Lincoln, he might have had some claim as a Republican, but as Roosevelt said back in 1930, the Republicans haven't wanted to be near Lincoln in years. Let's make him one of our own.
Right. So then can you just couple that just for a couple of minutes with okay, that's the actual theft from Reagan.
Right.
But what is the historical, you even say, and I bring up the Trilateral Commission. What was the actual process? Because we still see this in school textbooks today.
No, clearly.
That erase and distort
in fact,
American
you
history.
say we were cuddling on the couch.
Yes, you were.
And I mentioned...
And I still came through everything like a champ. You guys were tremendously
so distracted.
Yeah, it was incredible.
Oh, geez, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Sorry.
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
You should have just looked at, Okay, so here's the thing. So in the Trilateral Commission report, first of all, there was a Rockefeller speech that said something similar. There was the Powell Memorandum, which basically lays it out, but that was a private memorandum at the time. The public declaration of war on the progress of American democratic life is the Trilateral Commission report.
What year is this?
75. 75 is the publication.
Jump in too if you know this too.
Yeah.
Please jump in.
No, and I'm turning to you.
Okay,
Don't
great.
hesitate.
No,
okay?
worries. Yeah.
So, but you and I both have probably.
this.
The only reason I've read it more is I'm older than you are. I go back to it and back to it. I've got a rubber band to hold this thing together, and they lay out who the enemies are, who the threat to democracy is, what they call the excess of democracy, and the crisis of democracy. And you have to. What's the word they use? Dampen, temper, spit upon.
Dampening something. Like
that. We got to dampen the democratic spirit.
Right.
And they actually
They
name
say
it.
the phrase dampen.
And they use the language of efficiency because democracy is inefficient. So it's very tied to the emergence of neoliberalism as well.
Decided the cruise there. Yeah.
But then, so actually, let me go on a tangent for a second. There's a new piece in the Baffler. I forget her name.
Yes, I saw that.
Franzik.
piece. Yeah.
Is her last name, but it's called Century of Spin.
Mhm.
I interviewed her on the Majority Report,
Yeah.
but we'll be doing work here on this show as well. And so she actually traces the history of Bernays and Walter Lippmann.
Right, yeah.
But it's the same idea of democracy always needs to be mediated and tempered and controlled by elites.
Right. And this is one of the major claims of the progressive movement in the capital P technical sense of progressivism, because progressivism has left-wing centrist and right-wing instantiations, and in American history the right-wing instantiation has really become the most prominent, I think. And it's I would say, I don't know what you think, Harvey, but I think the modern American state with its peculiar melding, the post-1945 state peculiar melding of public and private, is really the triumph of the right-wing progressivism, in the sense that it's organized around expert management, a sort of contract, government by contract, the outsourcing of government work to private institutions, which is, has totally exists today with, now we fight our wars with mercenaries and things along those lines. So I think that in some real sense, and we could talk about this, and so this right-wing progressive movement has, I think, had this really conservative effect on American politics, not the left wing, sort of like the Teddy Roosevelt type of right wing progressivism.
I mean, I've lived long enough in Wisconsin that it's La Follett's are my definition of capital P progressivism. But
who are the enemies? I'm sorry.
So the enemies were not unpredictable given the moment. So help me out if I leave anyone out. So it's public employees, it's women, it's the poor, working poor and the poor. It's people of color. I think they used the term minorities at the time.
Right. Influenced by
Students
Moynihan. Yeah.
Yes, students. I think
The
was
Soviet
part of that.
Union very much.
Yes,
in there.
although but not in this list that I'm referring to right now. The dampening of
that aspect of it.
Yeah. No. But the funny thing is, no, it's not funny. I say funny nowadays when I mean crazy.
Tragic.
Tragic.
It's fine.
Yes.
We get it.
Okay.
Tell me.
They
Tell
at
us.
the end of their list of enemies, it's media, which are liberal media,
Jews,
and well,
And these are Jews, a lot of them.
Here comes the punchline.
Or the
one.
bad Jews, 'cause they're the
This
good
is the
Jews,
punchline
or
one, the one that takes us into the question of history.
Right.
Value-oriented intellectuals, which meant humanists, well, humanities people, and most of the social sciences. They were distinguishing, they weren't going to say all university professors because you had business professors and engineering and all that. So it was basically people like Daniel and I.
Right.
Okay. Do you go by Dan or Daniel?
Daniel's fine.
Daniel. Okay. It's like, sorry.
I like that. Hey, guys, you gotta have your fucking headphones on for these drops.
Sorry.
sometimes. All right.
Okay.
Do it again. All right, go ahead.
Okay, very
I
good.
gave you the parent.
So it
Yeah.
and what begins then it comes out. Now the funny thing is that the trilateralists were not the classic conservatives. They were not the Reaganites.
No, they were liberals.
They were liberals,
Yeah.
or the proto-neoliberals.
Yeah, liberals cum neoliberals.
Right. So
Scoop
it was
Jackson
David
type
Rockefeller
people, yeah.
was the money behind it. Brzezinski was the organizer. Jimmy
Daniel
Carter,
Bell was involved, I
Daniel
think.
Bell, Jimmy
Yeah.
Carter. I'm blanking on George H.W. Bush was in it.
Right.
Okay. So but
And he was
eventually,
considered a liberal Republican at the time.
Right, very
Moderate.
much so,
moderate.
Republican,
I don't.
right.
Liberals are liberal. That's pushing.
He
it
wasn't Rockefeller, but yeah, moderate.
Yeah,
Moderate.
yeah.
Sure.
And this, of course, is also well. So, but when we can skip over. The point is that they launch a war on democracy. Are you right? I mean, that's a good.
Oh,
way to put
I
it.
would say so.
So,
yeah.
so then can you build off of that and then connect it to the foreign policy dimension and how these guys intersect
Sure.
with the defense intellectuals?
Sure. So basically, what's really prominent at this time, and not to get too arcane, but basically they have a theory of society that society is a system, right? And that the way to manage the system is to have experts in charge of the system, and they'll move the pieces around, and the system will function. The problem, though, is that what gums up the works of the system is democracy, right? Because people are stupid. People don't know what they're actually doing, right? And so the purpose of I think the crisis of democracy, the Trilateral Commission report, is to argue in favor of this systemic management so that you'll actually be able to achieve what we're at, like Daniel Bell, liberal goals, like truly liberal goals, like full employment, things along those lines is going under this. But it's basically, I think at least, just an evolution of this previous idea that the defense intellectuals embedded in the national security state, which is this idea of expert management. For the defense intellectuals, they wanted to initially use psychological warfare and propaganda to trick people, but what the Trilateral Commission does is that they essentially remove people from the equation, right? That you can't even have, you're not even supposed to trick people anymore. You just have to totally remove them because this is how you get this system to work. And they're very influenced by like these system theories of the 1950s and 1960s, game theory, systems analysis, what listeners might have heard of. So I think there's this large project beginning in the, let's say, post-World War I era, but it has origins earlier. Historians always say it always happened earlier and more complicated than you think. But let's say in the post-World War I era, this fundamental skepticism of democracy. But the problem is, as Americans, they have to claim that they believe in democracy. So there's always this project, which is to use basically social science logic to de-democratize American politics. And the Trilateral Commission is a later example of the defense intellectuals of the early 1940s, 1950s, and even earlier people like Bernays and Lippmann, who argued in favor of like advertisement methods to trick the people to argue, to do what you want them to do. So there's this long, decades-long history of like trying to de-democratize American politics.
And so is that an example?
Yeah, the way I've often put it is, democracy is okay, but we don't want any more of it.
Right.
Okay.
And maybe and in
this case,
we want to reverse it. We want to reverse it.
And in this case,
Right.
because it was getting out of hand, it was no doubt getting out of hand. I mean, I actually would say that they really did fear the resurgence of the struggles of the 60s, but in a new light. Look, I mean, fear drives a lot of this stuff. And I think they actually feared that these diverse movements of the 60s might find their way, they might coalesce, or they might at least align. I mean, they were haunted still by the New Deal, these people.
And the rise of fascism too.
Yeah,
because mass politics is like a
right.
fear.
Yeah, but I think they were really they really did. Look, I mean, the New Deal is far more, and this is where we might well differ. It's a far more radical process if you see it on a scale beyond specifically the policies to try to lift us out of the Depression. It's a radical moment in American history, the 1930s. And they're haunted ever since. I mean, Kim Phillips' fine work, all of that, however limited it is at first, the fact is that they were haunted by the fear of a New Deal.
Especially one that would also overturn American apartheid.
And,
I mean, that's the thing.
No, exactly.
See, that's the thing that I
exactly.
think is really important. Just as I could just tell you, as like someone who's in this side of the equation, like. I just did an amazing illicit history for, I will plug, patrons. This is one you really got to hear, and I think we should probably unlock it because it's so brilliant. So she's a assistant professor of government at Cornell, and her new book it's a history of Medicaid and federalism and unequal democracy. And, she definitely, part of it is, and she says, look, I mean, Roosevelt, universal health care was taken off the table because Southerners, Democrats, were like, not only are we not, again, it's not even just the moral object, because yes, of course, they're horrible people and they don't care about health care for, let alone, obviously African Americans because they're horrible racists. But they also saw that if you come in here federally and you literally start building hospitals that services everybody in the community, we're done. This has far-reaching implications for ending. Right. So as I read her, and I think again, this is where there's a useful intervention, because I agree, and I think it's quite important to not have a rosy view of any part of our history and complicate it, and certainly see how everything's racialized. But then conversely, if you're just going to go and have that one read of, well, these were the fatal flaws and that's it, you're missing the full politics of it, because what certainly people on the enemy side of the equation, they actually understand, and particularly in the 60s moment, in the 70s moment, that if you synthesized uprooting the systems of white supremacy and institutional racism, and you fuse that with a completion of the New Deal into an actual American, fully civil, broadly distributed social democracy, well, they would be, pretty much done.
Roosevelt would. One thing I would argue that the Roosevelt administration itself did not build race into its policies, but you had the Southerners were in absolute control of Congress, and Roosevelt's logic was, if you don't start it, then nobody's going to get to finish it. Sure. So when Truman proposed national health care in the late 40s, what blocked it was basically the idea we don't want blacks in our hospitals in the South.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, we would have had.
This is Michener's history. Everybody, please read Jamila.
And in fact, I mean, for all of Truman's faults, which we can go on and on about, the fact is that he also launched, with the push from A. Philip Randolph, a series of, what we would call civil rights initiatives. The report that he had
we'll talk about A. Philip Randolph in the postgame. That's like a luminary people need to know more about.
Yeah.
But can you draw a connection though? Because I'm seeing an interesting disjuncture here. Because I feel like you're talking about, and they're fused together, but I can hear two different strains. So one strain is just American oligarchs who don't want people to have more well-being and more power. And you're also identifying, your work identifies a specific strand of intellectuals, mainly Jewish social democrats, who get so traumatized by Nazism that they go from being social democracy advocates to the architects of the military-industrial complex. What is the difference, and then how do they actually fuse together?
Sure. I think what's interesting to note in everything that Harvey's talking about is that all of this sort of expansions of the welfare state were totally linked to imperial adventures abroad. So the Truman call for healthcare comes right after the Truman Doctrine, right? With the national security funding. You think about the various Johnson Civil Rights Acts of the 60s in the midst of Vietnam, in the midst of the escalation of Vietnam. So you have this. No, that's fine.
Get to it later. No. This is great.
So I think that you have to view it in an imperial framework, and the goal for us today, I think, is to really develop a political language or develop a political ideology wherein you're able to get these massive expansions that were in the past, I think, at least justified by a sort of imperial adventurism without the imperial adventurism to sort of support these things. But I totally agree there are significant radical elements of the New Deal, even though I would guess, and I'd love to hear the critique, to me it's a little bit And I don't want to trash the New Deal. Like the New Deal was great. It's the best we got.
No, I'm not gonna. No, I was gonna talk about just the Truman.
Can we just add really quickly another historical an irony to this through a slogan? There's that idea that I think was first advanced in World War II by people like A. Philip Randolph. And again, it has to really be underlined, like not only American apartheid, but like a system of apartheid that like. When we think of South Africa, they helped design their system based off of what we did here, as did the Nazis. If you read this new book from Yale on, what is it?
Hitler's American Model.
Hitler's American Model. Yeah. I mean, this is and some of the things that the Nazis didn't replicate from the Jim Crow South were things like, whoa, that's a little excessive.
Yeah, Hitler
the
said,
one-drop rule.
Yeah, that was too extreme for Hitler.
Yes,
yeah.
The one-drop rule is too extreme for Hitler. So that's what we're in the United States. But I think
didn't keep from doing everything else.
Right. And
right.
Said,
no, totally.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And they said, there was the phrase of the double V, like victory, double victory of fascism abroad, and then victory at home. And then, of course, there is the victory of fascism abroad, but not at home. And then it flips in the 60s where there is some, again, just tangible, objective gains, not anywhere near a completion, but actual gains under Johnson. But then, just the genocide of Vietnam. I think we can use that word at that rate of murders.
I have 1,000 things to say, but let me go to one. Let me just go to one, regarding the Truman. And again, I'm not a Truman apologist.
No,
but it was within months after Roosevelt's passing, Truman took the Second Bill of Rights and issued it. Okay, and spoke it. So I don't see the one step as the second step. I don't see national health care as simply a device. I mean, sorry.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No,
but that's not what. Is that what are you actually arguing though?
That there seems to be a connection between some sort of militarism abroad and the expansion of the welfare state at home post 1945.
Yeah. Now, two thoughts occur to me. One, there's a thing that I would argue against.
Sure.
Except I also hear late 19th century Germany and Bismarck's creation of Social Security. So I don't deny. It would be interesting to try to untangle it, but I don't see the one as necessarily the impetus of the other.
Well, I mean,
because in 1930, when Roosevelt proposed Social Security, it was to include national health care, as we just said.
Absolutely.
And
well, but the imperialism component.
So basically, the idea being is that when the United States is fighting what is perceived as this global war with the Soviet Union, there needs to be a protection of the domestic front at home. And one of the ways to do that is to basically get white Americans on your side to fight this global war against communism. And I think the fair deal is part of that. And I think a lot of these Mary Dudziak's Cold War Civil Rights book, right? Which is the argument that the reason civil rights were passed. It's a brilliant book, Mary L. Dudziak. The argument is that civil rights were only passed in the United States because the Soviet Union was making such hay about it in the third world.
So that the brand of the United States, particularly when you're dealing with Latin America or Africa, or Asia, is that this is the most prominent, overtly, purely discriminatory place on the planet. That's a very toxic brand. To go talk.
I do. I like when you get hyperbolic, but
no, but true. No, I don't. I think that's objectively true.
Jim Crow South.
I mean, there's nothing competing with that. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Well, let me come back. There was something else. It was. I can't waste your time. Sorry. It was. The problem with Dudziak and the problem with folks who make that case is the fact that the civil rights movement is growing and it's building. And the fact is what makes it happen is the possibility that there will be an explosion in the United States. It isn't that the Soviet Union is what it enables is these, if you like, foreign affairs questions are well timed for the sake of the civil rights movement.
Right. It's hard to disentangle, I think, in historical time, right? Because they're happening together.
And let's lay out that we will be friends. The difference is that he's a foreign affairs historian, and I'm more of a social movement.
Do you think, though, just taking it forward, though, and again, I'm not, I'm totally valid neutral in this claim, so I'm not like somebody who I mean, I'd like to complicate how we talk about the Soviet Union for sure, but also look, it was what it was. And, certainly by the 80s when solidarity movements are going, anybody I think would say otherwise is being, disingenuous or delusional, which are usually my kind of two-sided answer to everything. You're either being disingenuous or delusional. Now, again, I following Griscom, I agree. I think that we actually should be talking about both 1917 itself, just the actuality of that is a great human accomplishment, and I think that there was obviously very sincere people doing and trying to do great things, and it went off the rails, and we have to understand why. But that being so, I'm not making a defense of the Soviet Union, but that being said, when you go to the 80s, do you think that the kind of social democracy that you're talking about, that first domestically has this huge pushback with oligarchic money and a sort of re-entrenchment of almost like the pre-New Deal political coalition blocking American progress, does that though also overlap with, by the time, we talk about being 90s babies, the total ideological collapse of growing up at a time where now it's fun. Now we get to be like, oh, the young Marxists and the social democrat, whatever. The way we grew up, if somebody came out on television and said, maybe we ought to not cut Medicare and maybe deregulating Wall Street isn't the best idea on the planet, that was like, whoa, who is that radical voice of dissent? Because there was complete ideological hegemony.
Right.
Part of that must have been that the Soviet Union wasn't around as a counterweight.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think Americans read
This guy had a totally different take. But go
The-
ahead.
the-
Well, first,
the failure of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War. The United States did not win it. I think that is what happened. The Soviet Union internally collapsed.
Yeah.
Americans read that as being caused by Ronald Reagan's defense spending, very naively.
Oh, we all know the Pope did it.
Yes, yeah, the Pope, David Hasselhoff.
Don't insult the Pope in front of Matt.
But,
He takes that very seriously.
I'm sorry, sir.
Yeah.
But
Is that a P on your cap? In fact, Pope. No. Sorry.
But I think that that it was read as the triumph of capitalism and unregulated capitalism. So I think not having the Soviet as the ideological other basically allowed people to coalesce around one particular ideological position, and that is basically neoliberalism, capitalism on steroids. And to the degree where just growing up in the 90s, the message was just totally to not believe in capitalism, which had been basically in a Marxist sense empirically verified by history, right? The United States won, was to be an idiot, effectively a fool. And I think you really got that. I think that ideological position really held until 2008. I mean, my sense of it was that it really held fairly cohesively until 2008, and a total misreading of the end of the Cold War, effectively.
Yeah, well, the one thing two things I would add, which are not to disagree with you. The war on liberalism / social democracy had to be pursued, not simply because of the absence of President of the Soviet Union. The surveys, the polls of the 1970s, right through the 80s, indicated Americans wanted more social democracy.
Right.
I mean, it was amazing to see the degree to which Americans still subscribe to what, for lack of a better term, a liberal consensus, and yet somehow it was overwhelmed by neoliberalism and conservatism. And
wasn't that just money and raw power?
Well, it was money and raw power, but we have to go all the way back to 1947 and Taft-Hartley.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
right.
I've got 3 dates which are
explain Taft-Hartley to
Taft-Hartley
people.
was
That's crucial.
So Taft-Hartley was this act, Robert Taft. Thank you. I don't remember Hartley's first name. Okay,
Jim.
Anyhow, so they enacted this law, which basically guaranteed that Southern states would be able to block the closed shop. It would be right to work states.
Right to work. Block labor unions.
Right.
It was the first major beachhead
and this was
fighting,
which was basically
because labor
against
unions had
labor
been winning
and against African Americans.
Right.
Period.
Right.
Because it was at the same time that both the AFL and the CIO separately, they were separate, were launching their own Operation Dixies to organize the South.
Right.
So first, that's a major loss, which also eventually leads, of course, to the fact that the maximum, in 1955, like 1 of every 3 workers was in a labor union. And at that point, in the private sector, it tends to drop little by little, and public sector workers are organizing. So the war on labor is fundamental. The second moment, and this is a tragic moment, is this. So Johnson is elected, and Johnson, he's basically got, and I'm creating a moment that may not have existed exactly like this. He's got both George Meany and Walter Reuther.
The two main labor
two main
leaders of
who
the day.
probably had little affection for each other.
Right.
Okay. Reuther is a social democrat. Okay. Meany is is what he is.
And Reuther was like a guy who supported civil rights. I mean, he was very good and on the right side of a lot of the equations.
It's often,
and Meany is more just to contextualize for people.
Right.
I mean, Meany. I think it's actually another big problem that the big takeaway from the 60s and 70s for people was that like somehow labor unions caused the war in Vietnam. I mean, it's really ridiculous and problematic. But Meany would be more in line with people's caricatured image, but more correct in his case than certainly Reuther's case of kind of like, hey, I protect my shop, and besides that, fuck you.
Fuck everyone else.
Right.
I mean, there's so many ironies built into this. So, for example, the AFL was actually the greater champion of national health care than the CIO because of a whole series of contract arrangements and all of that.
Right.
But having said that, but here's what happens. Johnson says to them, he lays out like 4 or 5 things that he wants to do. So civil rights and this and this and this. And he says, when we get this done, we're going to do labor law reform. We're going to smash Taft-Hartley. So labor, and people forget this, labor was very active in enabling the civil rights. I mean, African Americans and their white allies in the South they paid the price in blood, okay? But the lobbying effort that was staged by labor was phenomenal. And also, the 1963 March on Washington would never have happened without Walter Reuther's monies. In fact, most of the movements of the 60s would never have happened without Walter Reuther and the UAW's monies.
They actually do this. I'm forgetting the name of it. It might even be the one that's, I think, All the Way it's called. It's an HBO movie that focuses primarily on Johnson. It's okay.
Oh, yeah.
But they actually do a good job. I mean, one of the things that's great is it's a depiction of King, which shows him as a brilliant political strategist and tactician instead of just as a saint, which I prefer. And they show his relationship with Reuther. And, again, very much as a relationship of two collaborators who have a lot of shared goals, but their own agendas. And that's a great part of
the famous
film.
speech in Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, is actually rehearsed, you might say, at a major Labor Day event in Detroit. Maybe it wasn't Labor Day, but it was a big labor event. But here's the thing. This is what I'm going to get at. So when the time comes for labor law reform, it's the one filibuster that Johnson didn't break. Wow. And the vote on whether or not to end the filibuster, do you know about this? McGovern.
Right.
McGovern asked for permission, basically, to not vote to end the filibuster. So here's this pivotal moment.
Why is McGovern? Why do you know this? Honestly, I'm going to go on a tangent.
Because he's from South Dakota.
Why? It's just because George McGovern recorded a propaganda video against card check when Obama came into office. He has a horrible labor record. What was that about?
I think it's just a traditional. I mean, you're a specialist. This is sort of traditional protection of the own constituency.
He's saving his seat, right?
Yeah,
to save his
Yeah, but I mean, that's even when he's out of office, though.
No, but
that's very weird. I mean,
here's what happened. So labor law reform does not happen. That was moment 2. I haven't given you the moment 3. The moment 3 is in I do this all the time. 1978, when Jimmy Carter refuses to go for labor law reform. And this actually is when Doug Frazier of the UAW says, fuck you, I'm not even going to serve anymore on the DuPont Commission, which was a labor management kind of commission. No, Carter was like, he didn't support Nader. He didn't support labor. I mean, as I've always told people, he was probably one of the worst presidents of the 20th century.
Actually,
so
this is what we're going to do, because we're going to do the post game in a few minutes.
Wow,
but what time is it, actually?
No, I'm surprised how fast things move. I always forget.
It's great. Oh, gosh, yeah, we got to go to the post game. But before we go to the post game, I want, and I'm sorry to do this, because we know Jimmy Carter as basically a lovely old man. No, but honestly, can you just complete the loop and explain why, from the foreign policy lineage you look at, the Carter administration was also enormously damaging?
It was enormously damaging in 2 senses. I think one unintended, and then one just maybe intended. So one, by introducing the language of human rights into American politics without a socialist politics, as Sam Moyn has argued very much.
Illicit history rights are not enough with Samuel Moyn. Check it out.
This is great. So by introducing that, he basically paved the way for liberal interventionism, which became the dominant, I think, foreign policy ideology of the 1990s and 2000s. So that's very problematic. And then what's more, so let's say the first 2 years of Carter's term are defined by this human rights politics, which has these long-term effects that he couldn't have foreseen. Fine. But the second, I think the people don't appreciate about Carter is that in the last 2 years of his term, he really laid the groundwork for the Reaganite foreign policy. He becomes much more.
That's you touch on Afghanistan.
Yeah, Afghanistan, challenging the Soviet Union, Afghanistan, not knowing how to respond to the Iranian Revolution. Totally laying these ridiculous attempts to free the hostages, destabilizing these regions. To what end? Not pursuing our arms control agreements in the proper way. I think with the Soviet Union. So it's sort of you have the worst of both worlds. You have the worst of unthinking liberalism and this sort of liberal interventionism that leads to nowhere, and then plus sort of laying the groundwork for this Reaganite second Cold War of the early 1980s, which increases an enormous amount of money spent on defense, taken away from other resources within the American state, and then of course I think at least leads to the emergence of this militarist culture in which we grew up. Having all these planes at football games, all these military marching bands, etc. Is sort of this return to this 50s early Cold War moment. Was I think really Carter laying the groundwork, and that Reagan picked up the torch and really ran with it.
All right, folks.
And one last line.
No, we got to go to the post game.
Okay.
Got to go to the post game. Post game. I know it's tough. No. I see the way you're going to try to angle it in. It's not happening. Going to the post game. All right. See,
respect your elders.
I learned how to teach. Believe me, you are highly esteemed. Anybody else would have been kicked immediately
Then get these
out of the
people
office.
to become patrons.
Yes,
so
that's what I'm
this.
saying. That's what you got to. Thank you. Exactly, Professor Kaye. Become a patron today, right this moment. Patreon.com/TMBS. It's what allows all of these conversations to happen. The Future Illicit History series, which of course is quite apropos of all these conversations. You saw the trailer with the insights from Jeff Halper, Bill Fletcher Jr., Mark Blythe. And then in the theory readings, introducing you to ideas from everybody from Trotsky to Fatima Mernissi. We are going to go to the post game where you can join us. I'm actually not sure what's going on legitimately with this computer, so we might not be able to take your calls. But we'll take your Discord questions. We've got a bunch of clips to play. We have
Give me your cell phone number.
Jesus Christ. This is not. We're going to talk about Kissinger and Christopher Hitchens. We're going to talk about a military analyst who threatened to assassinate Maduro, and a whole bunch of. We're also going to throw Chelsea Clinton in the gulag. I resisted it, but it's going to happen. Join today. Get your tickets to our live show April 20th at the Bootleg Theater in Los Angeles. That's going to be an amazing show. Subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't yet. Spread the word. Patreon.com/TMBS. You can also find me, of course, on Woke Bros with Big Waz. Subscribe to the Bomb Feed. Check out Literary Hangover with Matt. And Griscom's cooking up all sorts of shit.
Well,
you can
Griscom's soon to be on Literary Hangover.
Well, yes, Griscom's going to be on Literary Hangover. We have links to all the ways that you can find Daniel and Harvey. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks to all of you. We'll see you in the postgame.